Good afternoon. So I thought that I would start with some more kind of foundations of regenerative agriculture, and I'll probably move through that fairly quickly. And so I really want you to ask questions that might pop up, not hold it to the end, because I'll flip through things, and I want you to slow me down or, take us in a direction that's relevant to you and your farm. And let's see here, see if I can see the screen. Okay. So in my world, I see a lot of people throwing around the word regenerative agriculture right now. And I think that it's helpful for us to just ground on what that actually means, because we don't like to see things, becoming buzzwords and getting greenwashed when it's not actually that, right? And then how can we help ourselves become more towards that regenerative? So in the most basic definition of regenerative, I think about what is a self-renewing ecosystem. So what on my farm is replenishing itself? How is it rebuilding, replicating, or making more of itself? That's really how I think about the regenerative agriculture. And so there's tons of practices and tons of principles in order to do that. But I think in the most basic way that I just look at the farm and the different enterprises and inputs and outputs on the farm and say, what am I bringing in that's so much that it's not making of itself, right? And usually that comes back to a fertility question. Most farms that we work with are importing their fertility. Oftentimes we're importing many other things too for the enterprise. And I also wanted to say it's not super realistic that we would all of a sudden just be having a complete cycle on our farm, right? That we had all of the equipment, infrastructure, and everything that we needed, right? So that we're regenerating everything. So we can prioritize and not be overwhelmed by that. We can prioritize what we want to really start building and getting to regenerate. And there's this pressure that sometimes happens with folks that I work with that, it feels overwhelming to them that, well, I can't, due to their context, it feels overwhelming to integrate livestock, for example, which feels like a very important component of regenerative ag. So when I talk about integrating livestock, I also want to say that includes, sharing manure, generating manure, and it doesn't have to be from your own animals that you're raising on your own farm. So there's a lot of ways that we can continue to regenerate the fertility cycle. And if running animals on your farm isn't in your context or isn't really possible at this phase, that's okay. You can still be regenerative, but there does need to be that component of fertility regenerating. So regenerative ag, it sequesters carbon and cleans the water and creates the habitat and produces food. So in its most basic definition, it's continually renewing. That's what I like to think about it. And that's an easy way because for me to think about it, because sustainability for me is kind of breaking even. And what I want to do with regenerative is go beyond breaking even. So that's how I differentiate it. Triple bottom line, three-legged stool, maybe you learned in school. But these are the foundational kind of grounding that I enter into regenerative agriculture with, which is slightly different maybe than some other practitioners. So I'm really thinking not only about the ecology, which is oftentimes what folks are thinking about. But I'm really also seeing how is this affecting the people, because we have a lot of inequity in our social and community systems, and then a lot of inequity in our wealth systems too. So how are we able to use regenerative agriculture to affect all three? When I look or get contacted by farms that are falling apart, the majority of them are falling apart not because of the ecology leg. They're falling apart because of their social system or their economic system. And so that's not something that someone thinks to hire an ecological designer for, right? And essentially, that's what's happening, and that's what I've observed as the pattern. And by consequence, of course, we increase the economic design, or the ecological design, right? But really often the failure is on the social end or on the economic end in the way that they've set up their farming systems. So triple bottom line, really important. Another really foundational piece for me and was a game changer when I started going down to New Mexico and the Southwest and learning more about holistic management. And getting that kind of training, I think, is extremely valuable. Now we have holistic management training all over the United States. I would encourage you to learn more about that. It's not just about running animals. It's about decision making. And that's kind of the gold piece that that I'm really into. So this design framework, I don't know if I have a pointer or not on this. I don't think I do. Okay. So it's defining the whole. So on that pie chart over on there, we're working with the wholes. We're thinking about the farm as a whole, right? And within that whole, we have your stakeholders, your decision makers, and then we have your context, or your land, your resource base, and then we have your money, the actual money. And so this is one way to look at when we're doing farm planning, because oftentimes the decision makers aren't fully inclusive. So we have to think about anyone who might prevent a decision from happening or an outcome to be different. So it's not just the farm owners. We need to include the people that are working on the farm, the people that might be processing our goods or distributing our goods, because they're going to come back and affect us socially and economically for our ecological enterprise. And so as we start to look at the deeper at the stakeholders, that can help start build our planning process to be a more robust system. Originally, Alan Savory was observing the Maasai in South Africa. And that's by observing this indigenous wisdom, it turned into the, did I say South Africa? Kenya, Maasai, the indigenous of Kenya. And really, people following ruminants is an ancient practice, right? And then all of the abundance that comes from that. And that's what happened is we saw that large disturbance of ruminants, long periods of rest, got a major bounce back in all of the eco sheds and all of the life sheds. So he was seeing this and seeing how could we bring this to farming, to livestock, the system. I'm not going to get too much into like vision and the holistic context, because it is a lot more in depth, but I encourage everybody to write down their vision for their land or their vision for their farm or their vision for their future enterprises and their current enterprises. So this, holistic context is that statement of purpose, what you're doing, the quality of life that you want to have, the different ways that you want to produce, and then what will be that land that you're working with to do all of that together. And the reason why this is important is because I see a lot of people who think they want to be a certain kind of farmer, or they were raised a certain kind of farmer, or they're told that, this is a really good market to get into. And in fact, they actually don't love doing that on the day-to-day basis. They would much rather be working with plants than animals, or they'd much rather working with animals than plants, or they can't do, marketing and sales, but they have to. They think they have to, right? So a lot of this is about like knowing yourself and then aligning that to your enterprises, some of that planning. So I really like this. It helps you make your decisions. If you want to get more into holistic management decision-making tools, these are some cards that you see on the left, and that brings you through a testing process when you're making decisions. I think it's a great one. I mentioned in the keynote this scale of permanence, and I just want to bring it back because all of us can do this when we're looking at the land. This is the original one, the 1950s one. P.A. Yeomans was actually an oil man, and he had a keen sense of being able to read the landscape and created a lot of distributed water. He moved water through hills and had a really good understanding of geology. So as he developed this scale of permanence, it really makes a lot of sense for how we're designing our farms. We don't have a lot of control about the climate right above our heads, right? But what we can do is know our climate or understand what patterns are happening in it and then apply that to the land. So we know that we're not going to be growing something out of context or outside of our zone or outside of a potentially changing zone, temperature zone, which is what we're seeing a lot of growers dealing with right now. I've reordered, here's some examples of other folks who have, kind of used the scale as well, changed the scale, added the scale. It's not that different than the original one, but it really is going from those harder things to change to the easiest things to change. And so when we're thinking about where are we going to put our buildings, I see a lot of people just plop up these new buildings, right? And not thinking about efficiency. And so this is really big in when I'm working in designing, is that we want to go from the house or the most efficient zone that we're going to as often as possible and stack our functions in that area. And then as we go out to the next enterprise that we need to visit, give water, food, prune, harvest, check, fence, whatever, we want to be able to do that in an efficient pattern. And so we start thinking about the farm as zones. And so this is where when I cross over the zones with the scale of permanence, we start to really see how we can more efficiently use the farm. And that, honestly, when you look back at the old farmsteads, this is wisdom that is usually already implemented. So if you inherit an old farmhouse, you likely have the things often in the right place. And if they aren't in the right place, it was because of a block that they came across that you should probably also be aware of, right? So you'll see the windbreaks around the zone ones on the north and the west. You'll see a decrease in evaporation around the homesteads. You'll see usually strategic placement of wells, distance from road, length of driveways. Nowadays, that's not taken into consideration. We can asphalt as long as we can go, right? Well, that's really not sustainable, and I can't afford that much gravel, right? So we need to think about how all these things play, even though we can do and manipulate anything now more in the modern day. And the scale of permanence helps us do that. If we have our some of our roads, buildings, or water lines mixed up, we can also change that. It's okay to undo something. It might not be cost effective though, so then we need to just rework that design within it, and that happens a lot too. You inherit a farm and someone decided to put 5 outbuildings all clustered together, and you can't even turn a truck around in there, right? See that. So we just need to think about how could we redesign the access to achieve everywhere you gotta go, on your efficient path. Soil is the easiest thing to change. We can move soil, we can push it, we can dig it, we can build it. So although it's the easiest thing to change, it doesn't mean that it's the lowest of importance at all. It just means that on the scale of the hardest to the lowest things to change, soil is very easy. We can dig, we can make earthworks, we can reshape, and so it's nothing about how important soil is, because we know soil is vitally important. Just reminding us of the original regenerators. Since I come especially from the Midwest, but we had them all over. Oak savannas are a dominant ecosystem, actually in the entire world. And so we have a very small amount of true oak savannas left. But the ruminants, the large herding mammals of all of the continents, built our soils. So yes, we have that geology, but the intense amount of grazing of diverse plants, the trampling, the hoof action, and the grazing built those soils. And we've quickly degraded them in a very small amount of time compared to how long it took to build them, but they also can regenerate right back. So thinking about how, we could bring back those systems, and maybe it's not that we're going to become a cattle rancher, maybe we're going to borrow our neighbor's cattle to run for a small amount of time on our land, and they go back to their farm. Same with smaller ruminants. So I'm starting to see a lot more collaboration so that people can get more of the original regenerators on their land. These are some other indigenous practices, farming practices, that I think are worth considering as we are experiencing more drought and flood. We're experiencing the 100-year storm sometimes at 10-year intervals now, 5-year intervals. Designing for, engineers and when we're designing for even just culverts, 100-year storms are not the spec anymore to design for. They're happening too often. Last year in my area, we had pretty severe drought. And so that was a really big wake-up call because previous to that, we had been in floods for probably 3 years. So as we start to flip-flop, this is going to happen more. We're going to flip-flop. And the same system that we use during drought, if we're drought-proofing our lands, also flood-proofs the lands. So more that we build the soil, the more that we have overflows for water, either swales or micropaths, key lines, subsoil lines in the water, the more that we're drought-proofing, the less impact we're going to have from the flood too. So I've really seen that happen a lot, particularly in the Southwest. Some of these others, waffle gardening over there, where in extremely arid and semi-arid climates, you dig down and create these little micro wind barriers even within your vegetable production. So in extreme droughts, you can grow down, makes this grid patterning. In some countries, they have machines that do this now. These are by hand in this picture. But creating as many kinds of microclimates as possible. So sometimes in the old world, we saw that with stone walls. Now all the stones are just piled up in a corner in my field, right, from the farmer who got all those stones out, and they aren't used. But if you look to Europe and some of the other systems that haven't broken down, those were all used as hedges for livestock and for windbreak. So a lot of people have a plethora of stones. Polycultures, the Three Sisters garden in the middle, corn, beans, squash, or Fourth Sister sunflower. Being able to use things that cover the ground, give carbon and give nitrogen all at the same time. So it's essentially like a productive and edible cover crop. right? When we look at our cover crops, we want to have at least 3 functions from them. And so, you know, are we getting a pollinator benefit from it? Are we getting a nitrogen fixing benefit from it? Is it building organic matter for us? What are the 3 things we're getting, minimum 3, that we're getting from our cover crop mixes? We could say the same when we do companion planting or polycultures or guilds, all the same thing. And so that's an ancient one, the corn, beans, and squash. And then prescribed fire is pretty important. You know, lineages of this regenerative agriculture. Don't need to go into this too much, but it's an amalgamation of lots of different paradigms. So I probably emphasize the indigenous paradigm more than any of these, but you will find areas of all permaculture, holistic management, regenerative in general, and soil no-till. You know, the no-till folks are in here, and then Rodale Organic, certified organic, all play a role here. These are some of the foundations that I think, you know, give us our context. We want to think about how do all of these apply to my farm. So particularly with the farm succession, being really honest and aware, like where was your farm and where are you now, right? Because that's going to show you where you're going and then where you want your children or your inheritors to go on that succession. And we're really looking at, especially when we're looking at legacy trees, we have to be thinking quite a far ahead. And to regenerate, we need some real fast growers as well. So to get a lot of that early carbon, those plants that are going to turn over a lot quicker. That's the early succession plants. So we're going to have the early succession and the late succession. And I see that's missing. Most farms have things that were all planted at the same time and then nothing else since then. So once those go, like the gentleman who was telling me about his, oh, that was you. Your farmer neighbor, right? He's taking out all the legacy trees. Well, there's nothing else coming in after it, so it really is a problem. And so we do want to get those babies coming back, and it often helps to put in the youngsters that grow fast and the super slow growers together. Plants want to grow in community together, so thinking about that when we're doing succession design. All right, so I'm going to skip through this a little bit. You know, it's important to me to, and you might see a couple slides, similar pictures, but getting to know your land, I'm constantly surprised how little people have asked questions about their land. And so it's not just about getting a soil test. It's really about understanding what is way, way, way below ground, and then also what happened in the far history of your land. And sometimes that's hard because we're disconnected from the previous owners. That hasn't been passed down to us, whatnot. But I really encourage you to find that out because it gives us a lot of clues. And there's actually a lot of historical photos of land. If you go to your historical society, and it's worth checking out, like, oh, that's why. You know, like I've got this horrible spot in my pasture, and it's because that's where the old barn burned down. And I didn't know that for a really long time. I knew that someone had shoved a bunch of stuff off the creek and down the creek, right? But I didn't know that was actually the footprint of it until I was able to find an old historical aerial of that spot. And I was also able to find, you know, a historical photo that showed how, you know, large-scale hogs were being used at my place. And that's why the trees are the way they are. They're very different in that area. But I didn't know why, right? And the previous owners didn't know why really totally either. So, yeah, looking at that. Looking at who are your people. You know, when we begin working with folks, just sitting down and talking to them about what you want, what you expect, having clear expectations and really in clear vision, because I find that a lot of people keep that to themselves or just only tell it to their partner. And so the more that we talk about that with our staff, the more that they're going to make good decisions toward that vision. So don't be, in addition to like writing down your vision, share that with everybody that you work with, because it brings much more abundance to you. We talked about the principles of soil health. I think, we just I can't underestimate the importance of this. And John Stitka's work that, then Gabe Brown brought to a larger stage. The succession, when we're thinking about our vegetable fields, for example, they can't stay in vegetable fields forever if they're not getting replenished. And there's lots of ways that we can replenish the fields, but rotating fields, resting fields, the way that we used to farm even like 100 years ago was so much more sustainable because there were at least 5 crops usually that were being rotated. And which included a time for rest. Resting is probably one of the hardest things to do because your mortgage doesn't rest, right? So being able to find areas that you can cultivate or ways that you can replenish your fields enough that they get a little bit of rest, with cover crops. Or mulching. You can mulch it too. But I'm always thinking about value adding the edges of my fields, and so that there's other nutrients constantly contributing to the fields, not just when the end of harvest has come and I get to do another cover crop. Like what's on the edges that could be constantly feeding that? Can we put a living ground cover? Can we put a cover crop? Can we put a prairie strip or a pollinator strip in between our annual beds or in between our annual fields? We'll see a lot more regeneration that way. Or can we put a perennial, like asparagus, or small trees or shrubs, the alley cropping way, so that we're getting more nutrients, activation, fungi, and systemic work happening. So that succession can mean a lot of things, ecologically, socially, and economically. That's Mark Shepard's farm in Wisconsin, southern Wisconsin. And he has done a lot of work with the USDA and NRCS and got them on board for a lot of the agroforestry practices that are now cost shared, which is really great. So we see multi-story cropping, riparian forest buffers, silvopasture, windbreak establishment, windbreak renovation, living snow fences. Some states cost share that. So there's a lot of different words and there's a lot of lexicon, which really is hard to navigate, frankly. And so I say go to your NRCS or your technical service provider and explain to them what you're doing. And then they can help you with whatever code it is that NRCS cost share it, because it's not always intuitive. And it helps bring in a map. And so if you bring a map and you say, oh, we're trying to plant some trees over here, or oh, this was a really big erosion hole or sinkhole, and we're adding in grasses here. We're putting in a riparian buffer around this, or plants along the water. And then outline those things. Say we're really wanting to bring animals on, but we can't afford fencing right now. What could you help me with? So that kind of thing. So explain yourself in plain and simple words. And if you get someone who understands you, great. If you don't, go ask for someone else, right? We have a lot of people that have been ignored and not helped also by the government system. And particularly, I'd say women and people of color. And go find another person. Just keep on being that person who needs to ask for assistance don't be afraid to do that. I've had to be pushy sometimes. Yep.
Can I ask, so some of those programs, NRCS, riparian buffers, alley cropping, planting perennials, to get that reimbursement, you have to have the deed to the land and be the owner. Do you have any recommendations or resources for some of us who maybe don't own the land and we're maybe on our own dime just scrapping together, planting those things? Apart from maybe like working with landowners to bid our way toward, yes, this will be managed in 12 years, whatever some of those requirements are for riparian buffers or tree plantings. If I don't have an agreement that I'm going to be there for 12 years, can you get around that?
Yes, you can get around it in some cases. So one, if you are owner of your enterprise, you're owner of your company, you're owner of your LLC, whatever it is. So with that, you can get cost share for fencing, for example, even if you don't own the land. So that's an important thing to understand. And you can also get co-signers for owners of land if you don't own the land for certain practices, because then they would be there. You can have an agreement, you can have an MOU, memorandum of understanding with them about your labor collaboration for that installation. If you're doing a wildlife, cost share kind of thing, that's less for a farming enterprise, look to some non-governmental cost share programs, which have oftentimes less regulation about the ownership of the land.
How can I find some?
I look to conservation groups, hunting groups, SARE grants, small grants. I've seen, help to get that little investment that we need. We just need the cool bot so that we can get our plant stock, or we just need that those few little leverage points that sometimes can make a big difference for a beginning farmer. You asked another question that I can't remember that I was thinking about for renting. Really document anywhere that you work. If you work somewhere else that can be considered ag labor. So we get a lot of people that don't qualify as Schedule F farmers because they haven't documented where they worked. And so then there's no history, and therefore they don't want to give you money or loan you money. So you can, anything that's like agrarian related, you can count towards your farming experience. So you may have heard right now that USDA has rolled out this climate smart agriculture and forestry program. This is a scientific journal showing that the biggest opportunities for climate impact, and it shows agroforestry as numero uno. And I think this is really big, and of course, many of us have known this before, but now you get an official study, which means that government moves money, right? And foundations move money. So I think this is significant. And you can check out the Commodity Credit Corporation. It has never before in USDA and Farm Bill ever been related to something that we would be involved in. So it's even coming out of a different program. This is new, and this hasn't happened before. So we're seeing major money, major shifts that are going to trickle down to everyone that's on the land. So Climate Smart Agriculture and Forestry Program. This is a report from the Global Change Biology in October of 2021, if you want to look up this study. So I talked about water today. This is all about cycling the water and how many ways can we cycle the water. And so we know that the more vegetation that we have, the better. So if you have parts of your land that are dirt, that are showing bare soil, you are desiccating your land. And so every time that you till, for example, you're going to take a hit to your water cycle. And so if you need to till to produce certain things, right, then how are we going to pre and post support that system through our tillage? And how can we more strategically till if we are tilling? Those are some of the questions that I like to ask when we're thinking about those cycles. Yeah, so just really understanding where these things are. What we're seeing, the power of perennials happen, for example, in the southwest, in the driftless of Wisconsin, where we have a lot of unglaciated rolling hills that used to have springs everywhere. We have, the best class trout fishing streams. We have extremely clean water there, a lot of sandstone and limestone filtering the water. And what has happened is all the plowlands have dried up the springs. And so slowly the springs that were up top don't exist anymore. And now the springs only exist on the bottom. And so that means that the whole cycle of the water is getting desiccated. And what we also see is that when we brought back perennials and grazing, springs started popping up in higher up on the hills. So this is an immediate, in years' time, that we're seeing this. This is not something that we're doing for our grandchildren. This is something that we can do right now, and it's incredible. And people don't realize that we can just regenerate the water cycle that fast, so I like to share those kinds of stories because it's very easy to destroy the water cycle. But people don't talk about how easy it is to bring it back if you really focus on it. Because nature's doing all the work for us. Same with the nutrient cycle. Since the Industrial Revolution or so, and World War II and whatnot, we went on to this synthetic fertility cycle. And the problem with that is that it's kind of like a drug that plants get addicted to. And once you're addicted to that thing, like synthetic nitrogen, it doesn't produce as much nitrogen itself, or even stops its own production of what it naturally would have. So this is the problem then, because it doesn't know what to do if we were to stop, right? So a lot of our farmers that are transitioning over to organic or away from conventional have a really hard time during those transition years because their plants were addicted, right? So they're going through a withdrawal period. So ways that we can support that withdrawal period really have to do with cover crops, inoculation, and animals, sometimes prescribed burns. But using those regenerative disturbance practices can help you through this kind of withdrawal period that we see. Healthy soil is living soil. Has anyone heard of the soil your undies test? Burying your whitey-tighties? We don't need fancy soil tests. They're nice. They give us a lot of information. But you can just bury your undies, literally, and then come back and dig them up. And you will see how much they're eaten, and you will see if your soil is alive. So these very basic techniques can give us a lot of answers, right? There's a lot of things like that we can do with just our senses to tell us what's going on with the soil. But there's a lot in there that isn't, that we can't see. So I love Dr. Lane Ingham's work, Soil Food Web, and she helped a lot of farmers get a microscope and just start seeing what's going on in there, right? We can do a lot without the microscope as well, but I think it's nice to have a microscope on the farm. And I think that the more that we get to know some of these other friends, the better. So her Soil Lab, Earth Fort lab, does biological testing and chemical testing. And so not just the physical testing. If you want to be measuring for, to get some baselines, I would say, sure, spend some money on a biological test. Most of my clients that do that, they come back at 0. So you pay the money to show that you got nothing, right? But it gives you the baseline, which some people want to kind of do that citizen science work, right? You could also bury your whitey-tidies and know you got nothing too, right? So there's a lot of ways to go about it.
I have a whitey-tidy question.
Shoot.
How long do we leave them buried?
It depends. You just need to be consistent as you replicate it. Yeah. So like a summer is nice, like 3 months. Mm-hmm. It's a fun farmer field day thing to do. Mm-hmm. Yep.
We've already identified who we want to do it on farm.
I really like it. Yeah. For you could dig a soil profile so everyone can see the layers of the soil, and you can talk about that. And then you could have a section where you had buried some things. And that's Practical Farmers of Iowa. They love those kinds of jokes. Their big logos are "Don't farm naked" for cover crops, "Soil your undies," all of that. But Practical Farmers of Iowa is hilarious like that. But also it's affordable, and it does give you real feedback because some folks had very holey underwear and others had almost the same underwear that they had when they put it in the hole. So it is telling us a lot. And it's all of these trophic levels that are eating, right? Because everything is eating. There is no vegan ecology. Vegan doesn't exist in nature, right? We eat each other. That's how it works. And so in order to support this, we want to support all of the trophic levels, and organic matter is a big one. So when we look at our soil test, you can get a $15 soil test typically from University Extension that at least can tell you your pH and your organic matter and maybe some major macronutrients. $15 is affordable, I think, to find out that baseline. If you don't want to do some of the more comprehensive soil testing like Cornell's soil health assessment or Elaine Ingham's biological testing. But yeah, finding out how much organic matter you have and your pH are definitely basic ones that will give us indications of how much work you might want to do or what needs to come in and how to inoculate that life. And then life inoculates life. So the more trophic levels you have, the more you'll grow. So if you added in something, but everything eats something, right? So organic matter and sugars are typically the things that we see that increase our invisible biological life. So that could also include things like molasses and raw milk, sometimes cider vinegar, things that are alive. And then there's a carbon, increase all of our invisible friends to increase too. So we know that plants talk to each other through the fungal hyphae and the mycorrhizal networks below ground.
Yesterday they know about 50 words on mushrooms. Their vocabulary is like...
I read that. I saw that.
Yeah.
That's incredible. So they've documented, yes, that plants and mycorrhizal are talking to each other upwards of 50 words at a time, the capacity of up to 50 words. 50 words in human language, right? This means that they're whispering, a drought's coming. This means that they're whispering, baby, here's some vitamins. The mothers give their food to their babies. They document it, right? We can follow the traces of their communications. And nature is very generous in that way, in that they're constantly sharing resources between each other. And so that's a lot of this communication that we're starting to understand as humans is far more complex than we could really imagine. So it's great. Like, it's great to know the details of it, like 50 words. But for me, I'm just like, let's just increase it because we know it's good. it's not something that we have to be worried about overdoing, I guess. The more that we increase it, the more that they're going to do their thing, right? So as the keystone species of our environment, we can dictate that. We can support that resource, right? The other thing is, that organic matter, back to that organic matter, really want to be following that because that 1% increase in organic matter on an acre holding 20,000 gallons of water in your soil, that's nuts. And when it comes to drought, we really need that. Typically, I see 1%, sometimes 2% organic matter on people's fields. So that's enough, of course, to grow crops, but it's not enough typically to weather a drought unless you have really good irrigation systems, and it's not enough to mitigate flood. So we want to get the organic matter up higher, and that's not just like putting a bunch of peat moss in your soil. It's actually having the full cycle of plants and animals, if plants and or animals, to break down and increase the organic matter. So cover crops, mulching is really great, and then adding the manure, fertility. Those are the easiest ways to do it. Rotating ground covers. And then once we have that, we know that the mycelia will start to balance the pH. So I don't worry as much about the pH unless it's way off. I'd rather focus always on the biology because that's going to do much more work for me faster. Here again, just like reminding ourselves about the soil. When I'm down in New Mexico, I'm amazed that they can grow anything from that soil. It looks like rock to me. And I know that I come from the land of plenty with very deep prairie soils and a lot of water. So when I compare my landscape to that, it's hard for me to wrap my head around that they're having thriving crops. But you just do different techniques, right? And the weathering of their soils is based on whatever your geology is. So knowing the geology of your place is important. I love geology too, so I am a little bit biased, but that stone actually does matter because your soil came from it a very, very, very long time ago through the weathering process, right? So knowing that bedrock is decent, if you live in places like Vermont or some places have bedrock very close to the top of the soil. So knowing where your bedrock is also kind of nice. Unfortunately, some areas have been tilled so much, and we've lost so much soil that we are down to bedrock or very close. So that's frightening. And that's going to dictate what kind of crops and enterprises you can have on your land. So the more soil that you have, the more options and diversity you have, and obviously the more water that you're going to hold. I would much prefer holding the water in the soil than doing some large earthwork, like digging a big pond. I still really like digging ponds, but I'm aware of how much energy it takes. And so, the number one way that we can affect ourselves and not spend too much money is by improving our soil and letting nature do the work. That being said, if you're a beginning farmer and you just got on land, I'd say buy a tank, right? And put up a little shed and start harvesting the water that way, right away, because you can't afford to dig a well. So, it depends what your context is, but you always want to be thinking about, how am I going to store the water? This is a way to think about organic matter. The pie chart is showing organic matter. Let's see here. So it's thinking about it kind of like the bank. So as money comes in and out really easily, 15% of the carbon and the other organic compounds are like really moving through quickly, just like bank tellers and like a checking account. And then 40% of the soil organic matter at any one time is decomposing. And so during this decomposition, the organic materials will be part of the soil for a longer period of time, like 1 to 10 years. So really thinking about what different levels of soil organic matter we're holding on to the soil. This is a different way to think about it. And I think it's important because some go away right away, and it should go because it's feeding it's feeding organisms. Another way is that the long-term carbon storage that we see in more perennials, shrubs, and trees is very important too. So there's all these different kinds. There's not just one kind of soil organic matter. So thinking about it like a bank is helpful. So I talked a bit about the degradation of the minerals in our soil, but we're just, we're seeing a massive decrease even in organic seed in the actual nutrition. And so America's food across the board is really, in the last 25 years particularly, has really declined. Calcium, if you grow vegetables, you'll know that calcium is very important to your field's health. What we're seeing is a massive decrease in calcium when we're doing tissue testing or looking at the output of the fruit and vegetables. And so that's a direct correlation to the lack of calcium in the soils. And then what is calcium molecularly connected to? All of the other processes that have biological processes that calcium is connected to. So it's not just the minerals, there's always enzymes and polyphenols and antioxidants and all these other nutritional pieces that are connected that we can connect to minerals. And so we can find that out by, it's cheaper to test your soil than to test your fruit or your vegetables, but you can do both. You can do tissue testing, especially if you're concerned about contaminants like heavy metals. I would recommend tissue testing and soil testing. So I talked about, the minerals in the soil. Dr. Christine Jones is one of my heroes, sheroes. You can find her at amazingcarbon.com. She's out of Australia, New Zealand, and she has identified the liquid carbon pathway. But this is just another way that we're understanding the communication that's happening between plants and soil and microbes and fungal hyphae, and why we're increasing carbon so much more in our regenerative soils, and why this invisible liquid carbon pathway is so important. So she was a researcher, she is a researcher, was a researcher, but it essentially just started running her own sheep, because you go towards the solutions, right? And she was able to turn over land, transition land so much faster, regeneratively rotating sheep. Even though she was really studying the microbiome and the microbes of the soil. But that's what led her to it. So these simple solutions, but now we're finding like the scientific backup for it. So check her out. 30 to 40% of carbon in the leaves can sequester 4 to 20 tons of carbon dioxide per hectare per year. She's hectare. This is just, it's about that cycling, and we can continue to do it faster. It doesn't matter, to me, it doesn't matter knowing like that scientific reason why. It's just, how can we do it? How can we do it better? How can we do it more? How can we do it faster? But there is now this nice science to back it up. We know that the soil cycles the water. Particularly if we have a lot of clay, we want to increase that organic matter. And Nicole Masters in For the Love of Soil kind of shows the differences in carbon that affect the soil, the water holding capacity in soil. So that NRCS statistic about the 1% increase equals 20,000 to 27,000 gallons of water. It varies based on the silt, sand, and clay component of your soil. That's what this is speaking to. Nicole says, without measurement, there is no management. And so these are some of the areas which aren't a bad idea to eventually test or get to know what's going on in your fields. And a lot of this we can just do ourselves without paying someone or going to a lab to do it. Simple things. These are simple things that I think a lot of our elders used to do. Dig a hole and fill a 5-gallon bucket of water and pour that 5-gallon bucket of water into your hole and start your timer. And time how fast it took for those 5 gallons to go away. And now you know your infiltration rate of your soil. You didn't have to buy a fancy machine to do it, right? So these are things that we can all do on our land to get to know it. I like to use all of my senses. If I'm not in a polluted area, smell, taste, touch, right? Wake up and use all of your senses. We don't need to be so disconnected from the land that we look down from a tractor and we send our soil sample into the lab and that's what we know about our soil, right? We need to get in there and start understanding it and start looking for the differences. Take a square, make a square and set it down and then dig in it and count how many earthworms you have in it. It's a really basic test that we can do, but it's a citizen science test that does tell us how much aeration's going on, what kind of biological life do we have in there, who's in there, what aerators are in there, right? So do an earthworm test, earthworm count, worm count. So a lot of these things we can do ourselves. What you'll find is when you have disturbance, then all those guys go away, right? So it, I think, impacts us more when we see that. When we see that they go away, when we see that they come back, then it trains us. It makes us better keystone species to do better. The temperature and the compaction. Temperature is an important one. The amount, the increase of evaporation, transevaporation that happens when we don't cover the soil is huge. So the soil is so much cooler. And when our soil gets too hot, we fry all of our baby microbes. It gets too hot for them too. So we have to keep the soil cool so that they're also happily living in their climate. All right, so just, really putting it in our heads again, diversity, diversity, diversity. That will always help you, whether it's in your body or whether it's in your field, as much as we can. When you bring in your holistic context planning for your farm, that's where you'll rein in how much diversity is possible. Because it's very possible to do too much diversity and lose the farm, right? And you can't be too idealistic about it. So choose strategically, where are you going to put the diversity? I've had folks get really excited about agroforestry and plant completely diverse tree rows. Well, it's kind of cool when they're young and it looks kind of cool, but it's a disaster for harvest, right? Disaster. It's also a bit of a disaster for pollination too. So when we're thinking, but really for efficiency, for being able to give any sort of guidance to farm workers, yikes, don't do that. You've got ranges of shade, you've got ranges of roots. I mean, it's not good. So while I'm not a monocropper, I see the values of choosing your top enterprises and being clear about that. What are your top enterprises? What is your top holistic context? And then see where you can add in the diversity. So I see a lot of the perennial foods and livestock mostly diversified by their ground covers and their edges. That's what we focus on a lot with farm design. So because you can add a lot more diversity in your ground covers without messing up your efficiency of harvest. Or you can have your buffers along your edges, hedges, fedges, whatnot, you can add all of your diversity in there too. If you're doing any sort of machine harvest, then you have to think about the width and where the diversity would hurt you, right? So again, if I'm going to do aronia field and I have a sweet new aronia implement that I can drive over the bush and harvest the berries because they all ripen at the same time, that's awesome. But oops, I planted hybrid poplars every 50 feet. Now my thing can't go over the aronias, right? So I see these kinds of things happen. And it's with good intention because they're trying to diversify and they're trying to not make it a monoculture, but then, you know, cut yourself short a little bit. All right, let's see. So the jar test, this is another one. If you haven't heard about it, very easy, just overnight, you know, and this is just getting, some people get really good with just their hands and can feel their soil this way, but just take a ball jar, fill it up with water, put your clump of soil in there. Overnight, it will separate out into the 3 layers, silt and sand and clay. And then you will see a percentage of what you have of each. So it's very easy, at home and free. Is there anything else I want to say about that? Chemicals kill, we know that. You can come back from chemicals pretty quick as well. So just helping people understand that whatever might have happened, whatever kind of chemical disturbance, we can start to bring that back. You're just going to have to go a little heavier on the inoculation to jumpstart the system. One of the biggest offenders that in my world right now is neonicotinoids in seed coating. So when you buy your seed, please double check that it's not coated in neonics. We're seeing that in a lot of the ground cover seed that's down there. No-till crops, this is the roller crimper with rye. Rye is probably, you know, especially in Iowa, these larger farming states that I work with, rye is being the most adopted by conventional and organic farmers alike because it's bringing so much more organic matter into the soil, and it really works well with corn and bean agriculture, and you can plant it after your harvest, and then it can have a root and hold that soil all through winter. It's winter hardy, and then in the spring you can choose your termination method. So this is the most regenerative method, second to grazing, where it just bends the stalk. So it terminates the plant to stop growing just because it simply bends it. It doesn't actually cut it. You could come in and mow it, you could come in and hay it, graze it, till it, spray it. Those are our main termination paths, right? So whatever fits your holistic context. I think the roller crimper is the perfect community-funded shared equipment. I'm really all about cooperative equipment. This seems like a perfect one because you don't have to have it all exactly at the same time. Manure spreaders and sprayers, I think those are also really good community shared equipment. Soil is the skin of the earth. Water is the blood of the earth. Wetlands are the kidneys of the earth, right? We want to protect the skin of the earth. That's a great Gabe Brown quote that you can't read. But basically, it's just saying that the more that we till, the more that we keep bare ground, the more we're going to perpetuate that cycle of drought. And right now, the earth really is struggling with a lack of water, despite the fact that we might be feeling floods in certain areas. So getting that temperature down on your soil is going to really help your microbes flow. Here's just another example of what's happening with our water cycle, how we're going to create our soil carbon sponge. Cows are probably the perfect thing to do that. When you're drilling your seed, inoculate the seed. Just inoculate it right in the hopper. You know, it's nothing special. Farmers are usually used to putting already, you know, if you're using clovers, legumes, people are used to putting an inoculant in there. So why don't we just do it with regular seed? Give it a head start. So I say, if you can, especially if you're doing a transition or you're on a new land or a really degraded land, if within your budget, try to inoculate your seed, your soil, and your plants. It will balance itself. Sorry, I don't know what's up with my slides here. This is a farm, Sharing Our Roots Farm, Main Street project, which we have a lot of different perennials happening, perennial systems happening. And I'm really excited in my area about hazelnuts. We have hybrid hazelnuts and integrating hazelnuts and elderberry together, and then running chickens, cows, sheep in between them. So you can hay it, you could graze it as pasture, and then those edges have berries and nuts that are half native. They're hybrid. So they're more resilient to drought. They're more resilient to the wind. They are in the native oak savanna polyculture, so they're like in their family already. They're like cousins, and they want to be together. You know, and you can put their like father oaks and whatnot on the edges. But this is the mid-story of the oak savanna, but we've bred them for farmer scale production. So Center for Agroforestry, University of Missouri, I mean, the germplasm that's coming out of there is amazing, and I would highly recommend any elderberry varieties that are coming out of there. But yeah, looking into this shrub agriculture, thinking about chickens slightly differently. You know, when I farmed in Guatemala, I couldn't believe that all the chickens lived in the trees. And then I realized, like, of course, that's how they always were. We don't know that. We don't understand that, right? And here, we don't even recognize or know a prairie chicken anymore. So we have the jungle chicken, we have the prairie chicken. And we always want to look back at, like, where did these animals come from, and how did they evolve, and what are their gifts, and how does that apply to my farm? How can we apply their gifts to my farm? And what was their original habitat? So I still see like turkeys around me, like native turkeys way up in the trees. And I should have kind of put it together, right? The chickens would do the same. Makes sense to get away from predators and whatnot at night. But that's really not how we run chickens here in the US. So how could we think differently about that? How can we give them more cover from their predators? I think integrating this alley-cropping and silvopasture with shrubs is a really good way to do that. And economical, because elderberry is pretty cheap. Abundance breeds abundance, yes. So just increasing as much as we can. If you have a diverse ground cover, you're going to see more diverse microbes. If you have a diverse alley crop with your shrubs, you're going to have more diverse pollinators. So that's what I mean about like the abundance breeds abundance. Here I'm doing rye with elderberry, black currant with a bee lawn. So there are different scales and people, you know, wanting different things out of it. But essentially I'm all about the blue, black, red, dark green, purple. Those have the highest nutrition. It's kind of like the sunscreen of the plant. You know, in cabbage, when we're harvesting the cabbage, they take off the most nutritious outside layer that has the most sunscreen, that's absorbed most of that has the highest nutrients on it. That's the best thing for us to eat. That's the one that they take off before it goes to the grocery store. But we can grow our dark colored fruits. That's where we're going to see a lot more of our nutrition. But it also gives a lot more diversity for our pollinators. So a lot of the farms that I work with, I try to push those colors with their crops if they're growing berries, particularly. Diversity in the margins. Because we've chopped up all of the ag lands, the wildlife can't get where it needs to go. And this isn't just like the monarchs migrating. This has to do with all of the kinds of wildlife. And so the more that we can increase those wildlife corridors along the edges of our farms, the more we're giving them pathways, and we're also like directing them where we want them to go versus where we don't want them to go. We can call it a fedge, a food hedge. We could value add those edges with things that we don't mind for them to nibble on, but it also kind of creates a path for them because we know they're trying to get to the water, they're trying to get to their family, they're trying to migrate. And when we have these big machines and larger scale tillage systems, they can't get across these places. And the decrease in habitat means that their numbers are decreasing in general. We're seeing a lot of animal migration we've never seen before, right? We're seeing jaguars show up in Mexico. That hasn't been happening. They're coming north. This is habitat issues. We're seeing unprecedented amount of bears and wolves also moving into new areas right now. So this wildlife corridor concept I think is really important and for all of us to embrace. The pollinator, I'm not skipping pollinator because I don't think it's important. I just think that I have talked about it a good amount, but I think that even if you don't get cost shared for pollinator, we can do so many affordable pollinator insectary islands. We can do a clump. Maybe you can't do a whole ground cover. You can do little insectary islands. You can do buffers. You can do annual pollinator too. Integrate that, like sun hemp. It's giving us some nitrogen and pollinator, right, as a cover crop. So I try to always add in pollinator as one of the functions of the diversity, no matter what kind of plant I'm harvesting. These are goats eating, this is a remediation site in which there's black walnut trees and there's a bunch of honeysuckle below it. And so the meat goats have girdled all of the honeysuckle and no chemicals were used in this process. And then after that, there was a forestry mower that came through and took the girdled honeysuckle down. Transitioning, so whenever we're transitioning land, whether that's from like a conventional farming or an annual to a perennial, I like the indigenous methods of transition. So fire, and then cover cropping. Of course, this has to be relevant to your context. So if I'm working with you in the Southwest, fire will not be my first go-to. But up north, it is. So it just depends where you are and what your context is. Again, if I'm thinking about the transition for cover crop, I'm gonna want one that's below ground. So think tillage radish, daikon, something that's giving me something below ground that's going to decrease my compaction. So it's going to rot in the ground and then leave a big old hole for microbes to come into. So that's why I want that root cover crop. Then I want something on the top that's growing, that's covering the soil. And then ideally, I have something that's growing a little bit taller that gives me a flower or a fruit or a seed. So those are kind of what I'm thinking about. They all support organic matter, obviously, and help balance pH. And they're also kind of like salads. So people, don't think about eating their own cover crops, or maybe they think about value adding it with their livestock eating the cover crops, but you can also eat your cover crop. And in fact, cover crop seed for kale is far cheaper than the kale we buy for planting our own vegetable kale. So if you're doing like a fodder cover crop, you can also eat that. You can eat your radishes, you can eat your barley. So you can also have your own edible cover crop. Trying to keep some sort of living root is really important. You're not going to get the sequestration if you do the monoculture. It just breaks the cycle too much. That's Phacelia. Phacelia is a wildly abundant, source for bees. I would mix it with something else, but this is rye and vetch and phacelia together in a very sandy soil. So we're trying to build up that organic matter. So these are all the things that cover crops can do for us, and each one of those might have some plants that are specific to them, but this gives us an idea of like, how can we get more creative with our cover crops? Increased soil aggregation. This one is when I get a clump of soil and I dig into the ground and it sticks together. That means that I have like the aggregate, that it's stitched together. Another way is I would take that aggregate and I'd put in a jar and put water over it, and it just turns to dust immediately, kind of becomes brown water. I don't have a good aggregate. Probably don't have any aggregate in there. So you can very simply, take your clump of soil and put it in water and see what it does. It's going to give you some feedback on what's going on in addition to that soil test or the jar test. But yeah, the aggregation is important because we have the glue of the soil holding it together. This glue is very important for carbon sequestration in the liquid carbon pathway. So here's just thinking through some timing on cover crops. I think timing is one of the hurdles when we're first getting into it, especially with tillage agriculture and especially with four-season climate farmers, right? So getting that seed in at the right time is, once you learn it, and it's fine. It's not a problem, right? But I think there's a pretty large learning curve, at least there was for me. And so this is just an attempt to have some real simple understandings of where I could put a cover crop in my season. It also has to do with what kind of veg you're growing or what kind of plant you're growing, and when you can get in the field to do that. Very early spring for me is too muddy oftentimes to get my cover crop in to have it be done when I want it if I'm doing a really early spring. So it's actually better for me to do a cover crop in the fall so that I already have a head start and that I'm getting it growing. That means my harvest has to be done early enough that I can get a living root before it freezes, right? So it's all about timing. So I like to just draw it out. I'm a very visual kinesthetic learner, and so I just write out all of my months, and I put in my crops and my enterprises first, and then I see where the gaps are. So if you're growing 120-day season, if you're whatever days you're growing for, then you'll see the break, and you'll know how much time you have left. So I just literally just put it on a calendar, and then I can figure it out that way. Cover crops, we just, there's a lot of resources out there. What I see is that, 3 to 5 cover crops are the main ones that everybody uses. So let's just, let's look a little further of what we could do for cover crops. Sometimes things are, like in the grain area particularly, they're not thought of as cover crops. So think about grains more for cover crops. Also, they can sometimes be more economically efficient and still give us a ton of carbon or organic matter. The Diffleys of longtime organic pioneer farmers in Minnesota radically changed their land before cover cropping was really known about with sorghum Sudan grass. Sorghum Sudan grass looks like corn. I highly recommend planting sorghum Sudan if you're like the odd organic person in the neighborhood and you just moved in. It's kind of like the undercover because it looks like you're growing corn, but really you're just growing the cover crop. And you can graze it, but it's a really amazing in places where I've been into subsoil. There was almost no topsoil, and we just actually cut the sorghum Sudan as the termination method, and you can watch how much microbes you have or don't have. The earth will just suck it up, which is amazing because it's a huge amount of biomass. So just laying it on the ground even. But what the Diffleys did was they tilled it in. They tilled it in multiple times, and they had heavy clay, and they're organic vegetable farmers. And so tilling in the sorghum Sudan, after 3 rounds, they eliminated the flooding around on all of their neighboring farms. That's how much organic matter they changed their soil texture, color, with just the sorghum Sudan. They did mix in some crimson clover and some other smaller ones, but it was really sorghum that was doing the heavy work there. So Gabe Brown calls it cover crop cocktails. Minimum 3. I'm really into the goats and the sheep for any sort of restoration and any sort of aggressives or invasives. It's booming around me. I can't find enough people who know how to run animals to do invasive management. So if you're an animal person, like, consider this as an enterprise for yourself. So not just running it on your own farm, running it on other people's farm that really need help to manage the aggressives. This is a huge industry, and it's very immature right now. So as it's starting to grow, we looked to some of the pioneers, particularly out west, who were running goats for blackberries. The highway department even runs goats for blackberries out west. We saw the kudzu, to manage the kudzu in the south. We're starting to see every area of the United States that's getting overgrown for many reasons why these invasives are increasing, but they're increasing. And what's the best way to deal with them? It takes the DNR often, 5-year studies to prove that the chemicals don't work, that it keeps coming back. But we're just continuing to increase our chemical input into the watershed. What does work is animal management, and sometimes a combination, right? But really serious impact done by animals, extremely regenerative, and a source of money that's a growing enterprise opportunity. Really into the multi-species grazing. I don't say that lightly because I understand that the fencing is really an important question, and then your experiential knowledge with those animals also really important to understand. But the impact, again, in combining a flock and a herd and having a FLIRD, for example, we could see a lot of benefits from that. So the flock that's helping with the pest management, with eating insect eggs, fly larvae, whatnot, the scratching, the aerating of the manure patties, all of that is really beneficial. So adding a flock to your herd can be a really, really great idea. And you might need to work through how that works best for you. Does it mean that your chickens are in a tractor and you're pulling them? Does it mean that they're open air? How's that gonna work for you? So there's a lot of ways, but you gotta really think about that. Different levels of forage. So the cows are going to graze at a higher level than the sheep, so that they're nibbling on multiple layers of solar panels, right? So we're thinking about all the different layers of solar panels available for the ruminants to eat. And then if the sheep are grazing down, or horses or whoever are grazing down too low, then they're going to get sick. They're going to have more parasites. They're going to be taking in too much, right? So we're managing those heights of the solar panels. That's how I think about it. And that we have enough to go on. And really, if you have enough land, then I would just say flash graze is the most regenerative. So we'll see in the larger scale, like Abe Collins, Gabe Brown, some of the larger scale regenerative farmers, they're not eating that much. They're eating, the top candy and a little bit further down, so a little bit more protein, and mostly they're trampling. They're getting the hoof action. They're getting the saliva interaction with the grasses, and then they're moving on. So they've inoculated a large amount of biological activity, and they're actually not going down too far in the carbon. So my buddy Kyle, Diversity Landworks, has a goat business, can't keep up with contracts. We need more people. Most all of his contracts are government or nature conservancy. These are large-scale lands with a lot of aggressives, invasives. We have these on our homesteads. We have these on our farms as well. So you can bring them back and do the work at your own place, rent them out to your neighbors, or get larger scale contracts like that. One thing when I'm thinking about succession, there can be different versions of this, but correlating the animals for your years of succession. So if you are an animal person, there are things that are maybe better for like different stages of your farm. So different behaviors of animals can match different things. So if you're looking for, I don't know, if you're just starting out, I guess just starting out or at the end. So we find goats deal really well with the aggressives, right? With clearing out the brush. We also find goats on the cliffs of Afghanistan eating who knows what, right? So they're at the very beginning of succession, at the very end. And so that's where they're best. Most people don't have a goat ecosystem the entire way through. You would usually balance out with some sort of ruminant in between or poultry in between. So thinking about where does that fit best in the succession of your farm. Pigs, you know, they're really great for site prep or for end of season harvest. Running pigs through to clean up the fields or running pigs through at the beginning to do some tillage for you or disturbance for you. Or compacting a pocket pond for you, right? How could you use the pigs and the gifts that they have? Yeah. All right. So, any thoughts or questions while we transition? Yes.
When you said that they're grazing the top and whatever, are they still trying to mob graze and hit it quick, or they just go across and get the ice cream? So I think at one time, wasn't he saying a third? And is he still doing that, or is it even less than that? Am I framing the question very well?
Yeah.
When you mob trample, you almost have to trample, right?
I think the trampling is the best. So if they get some of that candy, great. I think that's okay. And that might include like the flower or the seed head too. So there's more nutrition in that way. I think with horses, it might be a different, we're always thinking about what is that forage that they're grazing if it's not a super diverse. Gabe Brown calls it the armor of the soil. So how are we keeping the armor of the soil? And a lot of that is the roller crimper or the trampling, and where we see this large amount of microbes then having access to carbon or sugars. So I think that's the key. But there is a lot that's going on that we don't see with the saliva interaction with the grasses too. So that part, that's fascinating to me.
Some of the pulling action of it too, I had totally forgotten about the saliva thing, but also kind of the way they grab and pull, is there a reaction in the roots or the something?
There is, and that's with any plant, and that we found, especially any plant that's evolved with humans, that it likes to be pruned, it likes to be nibbled on, it likes to be bitten, it likes to be blown in the wind. I'm sure you've experienced veggie starts in a greenhouse that didn't have any fans, and they're just little weaklings because they didn't have any resistance, right? They didn't have anything interacting with them, and all plants are like that. So that's why the conservation concept doesn't work for me. Set it and forget it, because the plants aren't meant to be set and forget. They're meant to interact with us and the other, species. Keystone species. I haven't thought about that for a little bit. Even the way the tongue works affects that. It's perfectly matched, the way that the cow's tongue works with the evolution of grasses.
I used to have horses and cows, but where I live now, winds gets out. There's so many subdivisions, people are take the deer fence down in the fall, and I mulch it and do all of that, and then I put the deer fence up before we plant in the spring. So I get plenty of tracks through there, so I'm assuming it's doing some of the same purpose.
It is. It is. Yep. And the impact still counts, even if it's not mob grazing. Definitely. And you're still getting that interaction, the increasing your wildlife corridors.
Herds of deer on my plate.
Yeah.
Herds of turkey, or flocks of turkey, herds of deer. No predators, unfortunately, other than bobcat.
Yeah, we can work with deer. I know deer are a big problem for a lot of people. And so I like to work through the deer issues with folks. Deer don't like small spaces.
Yeah, I mean, ours sort of have a track. I can actually put deer fence up on 3 sides of one of my fields, and they don't bother the other side because of the way they travel. And I have another one, I put the deer fence up, and they usually won't bother unless we have drought, or very late in the fall after I've finished harvest. If I have the fence up. But I also put that little sprinkle stuff around the outside.
And that works.
That works.
Low cost way, if I'm working particularly with beginning farmers or folks that don't have as much money, single electrical wires, do one at the low height and one at the high height.
It only works when the sun is out enough.
For your solar power.
Before I went deer fence, I did do that, and as the days got shorter, it didn't work enough for the deer.
Sure. You could do it with hard fence too, unelectrified. The point is that, or you could do it with the living fedge, the old European solution. But the basic thing is like the deer doesn't want to be in that 3-foot spot. That's a weird thing. So if they can't jump all the way over it, right? So if you create this little space, that's the old world deer management way, but we can do it with fencing or high tensile wire or living fence. Ideally, there's one low and one high. It's very confusing to them. For us, we see also like the decrease in the coyote pressure when we move the fence because they don't understand moving fence because the fence is the predator. So there's a lot of like tricks with that, with the fencing. They think that we can increase our community knowledge about. Okay, so a few more things that I wanted to just touch base on because we're thinking about site analysis when we go to this demonstration site, but then also just like a few more ways to deepen our inoculation understanding. And I think the foliar sprays are really accessible. So a lot of people can't afford or don't have access to a manure spreader or a tractor to use the manure spreader, right? And so we can get a lot of bang for our buck with the sprays. And I've had a lot of success with that. And then also even with this picture, for example, I had a lot of, I'm going to blank on it. Aphids. I had an aphid infestation on the hemp. And all I did was Dr. Bronner's peppermint oil soap and water. That's all I sprayed on the hemp, and I had no more aphids. So the very powerful peppermint oil is all I needed, and it was super affordable. And I was able to do it on a smaller scale. So I just wanted to share, sprays can be really valuable. We can do tons of kinds of different sprays. Michael Phillips, if you go to Grow Organic Apples, or Fedco also sells all of his recipes. Check those out. But we can also make them ourselves. We can chop and drop comfrey. We can chop and drop nettle or horsetail, put it into a 5-gallon bucket with water for a few days, and spray it on the garden, spray it on the farm. Fish hydroslate, seaweed, and EM1. Those are really going to speed up your microbiology. If you want to pour a little molasses in there as well to get some sugars going for them to eat, great, awesome. The neem, you got to be careful with that. That's a universal pollinator killer, but it's also a more organic, less toxic way to deal with an outbreak So I use it strategically. If you need to use it strategically, it's very powerful to use the neem. But I would say definitely use that if you need to. This is my horsetail and garlic scapes, leftover garlic scapes I was overabundant in. You can use so many different kinds of compost teas. You can put your worm castings in the water. You can put regular manure in the water. Again, if you don't have something to spread large manure, think about how could you do it as a liquid. Thinking about inoculating animals, like in the same way that we inoculate ourselves or we want to remineralize ourselves, it's the same with the animals. So we see a decrease in parasites, increase in immunity when we add cider vinegar to water, for example. And you can even get automatic inoculators for water that will put vinegar in there, or you can just pour a little glug in there as you want. Mineral feeders on the bottom, you can build your own. You can make your own wooden boxes with the rubber flaps, and the animals will learn how to get in it and will stay rain protected. You can have even your animals eat biochar, right? One of the the best ways, I think, to use biochar is to have it go through the cow's system first and poop it out. That's probably the most value-added way that we can do biochar. This is King Stropharia wine caps. This is super cheap. When you do King Stropharia wine caps, sawdust spawn, put it in with a layer of cardboard, maybe some hay or straw or wood chips, something carbony and woody up there, and put it in the middle. It's just helping your plants talk to each other. It's decreasing it's increasing resilience to drought, and you can eat them, So you're getting a lot of functions from that. So inoculating with mycelia. Radical Mycology by Peter McCoy is probably one of my favorite mycology books. Highly recommend. But it also is teaching us how to train. So mycelium is super smart. So I loved that you knew the 50-word thing, that you had just been on top of that. But basically, it's a hyper learner. So in 2 weeks, I can train the mycelium to eat the cigarette butt. So you start with a plain butt that's never been smoked, and you start it to get eating that. And then you put in some polluted butts that you may have picked up, and a little bit, because it's toxic, right? It has to learn how to deal with the toxin. Slowly, slowly, it learns, and it can eat the whole jar of the butts. Same works with an oil spill. Same works with E. coli. So you just train it, and it takes a little bit of time, and it will learn it itself. Terra preta, that's the original biochar from South America. But I think, we're figuring out how to do this a lot better. Pyrolizing wood, getting a lot of that surface area increased in there for microbes to inhabit is basically what we're doing. So it kind of looks like charcoal, right? So very slow burn, pyrolyze it, and then we inoculate it. So you pee on it, you put some yummy goodness on it, and then you let the microbes do the work. Then you put it in your garden. Inoculating the cover crops, kind of talked about that, just inoculating seed. I like measuring things. I think that there's a great importance. I also think that there's an expense sometimes that comes along with it. But particularly if you have this is a monitor in a no-till conventional field. It's monitoring how much water is coming off of that field. So keep your eyes open for, it was cost shared by the Soil and Water Conservation District. So sometimes you can get other people to help you do the monitoring, which I think is worth it. And then observation, observation, observation. So do you have a farm journal? How are you tracking what's going on? Because I have a pretty darn good memory, but I still can't remember all this stuff, right? You just won't. It's not like you're tracking what you planted. This is about tracking what you see or what happens and the weather conditions that year. How did the land respond to that? So then you're learning, and then the next year you might choose a different response. So weeds tell us a lot. Weeds tell me a lot. It's like, oh, there was just recent disturbance here. Or, oh, this, I'll see a lot of nettle in the corner of a field. That's because all of the excess nitrogen was running off of there from the conventional field down to that low spot in the corner, and the nettle is able to deal with that, thriving off of the over-nitrification of it, and it's remediating that. It also means that there's too much nitrogen in the field, right? So it's that indicator species that we're looking for to tell us what's going on. And then looking at your plants, desiccation, we've got issues, right? We should have plump, shiny fruit and veg. That is the highest vitality. I know it sounds really simplistic, but actually if you look at a lot of people's veg and fruit, it's dull. Or in a few days after it's picked, it's sunken, right? That means its nutrient density is low. Okay, so looking at the pollinators, like who's there and who's not there. If you get into this, it's really cool. Sometimes you can have, you could have events and you could count how many pollinators you might have on the land. You can look for also like bat studies, for example. You can get people to count how many bats you have. It's a cool little machine. So there's lots of ways that we can find out who's around and what pollinators there, what aren't there, and that would tell us maybe what we should add into those hedges, edges, fedges of our fields. The water, like who's there? Certain people, certain animals will only show up if the water is clean. Certain pollinators will only show up, pollinators will only show up if they have that habitat, pollen or nectar that they need, right? Or mud, whatever it is that they need. And so just taking note, like who's there. When I have a year that the swans don't show up, I'm like, what's up, right? And I talk to the neighbor who's, I know, having some runoff onto my land. And I'm like, what changed? Like what, I follow the path, right? Like I'm a little land detective. Because why didn't the swans come back, right? Luckily the next year they did. So sometimes you don't know the answer, but you remembered that because you tracked it in that journal. Baseline testing, I slightly mentioned this, but these are all kind of the different levels. Think about any of that might be appropriate for your land. So if you have a very old orchard, for example, arsenic and lead was standard to be sprayed on old orchards. You need to know that if you have an old orchard. If you have an old farmhouse, within 10 feet you likely have lead in the soil. You need to know that, right? If you have children digging around or you want to put your herb garden right next to your house. So a lead test is not very expensive. We also can use flax, sunflowers, and mycelium to uptake lead, arsenic, and cadmium out of our soils. So we have ways to deal with it. It's very hopeful, but we need to know what we're dealing with, so do the test. These are just different journals, different ways. You can, that's Moses's organic journal, that's a free download. You can have your own one, whatever works for you for your season, but just tracking what happens. It's very helpful to me to have a prompt. If you're artistic, you can make them even cooler. This is a holistic management form of monitoring called the bullseye method. This is kind of fun. I like this just because you could use it for so many different ways. Basically, the way it works is there's gold in the middle, gold, silver, bronze. So good, best, good, better. I don't know. It gets worse, right, as it goes to bronze. And then each of the spikes of the wheel are the thing that we're monitoring, that we're looking for. So you can make any of the spikes that you wanted to. This is the holistic management one. And so bare ground, erosion, plant pedestaling, litter amount, litter, really looking at like how many plants are on the ground. Litter distribution, litter incorporation, the dung breakdown, how fast is your poop breaking down? You notice those GMO corn stalks don't break down? The percent of desirable plants, the age class, the plant species, living organisms, the canopy, how vigorous the plants are. So you can put your dot wherever it is in gold, silver, or bronze, and each year you can see how your bullseye changes, or each season, depending upon where you live. This is the refractometer. They're about $100, and they really they can help us. They help us measure bricks. That's the amount of sunlight coming through in the water. Bricks, B-R-I-X. And so this just squeezes it for me, so that squeezes the berry. Viticulturalists or vineyard folk know about this, but we can use it, grazers can use it. You can do it with grass. You squeeze it and the juice goes into the refractometer, that's up top, it goes on that blue lens, and you flip the plastic top down, and then you look up to the sun, you look through it, and that's what you see, those numbers. And then that tells you how's the sugar and how's the sun in your fruit. Because light is everything, right? Light is life. So we're looking at that amount of sunshine in there. This is me trying to show you what it is. Might not play. Oh. It's fine. So what I'm saying is I'm looking at this old elderberry that I found. And then I'm comparing it to this new elderberry that I found. So I'm talking about, look how old and look how dry that is and dull. Versus the first one that I was looking at, which was shiny and plump. Then I looked through it, and the dull one would not even register in the refractometer. So it was like 0, 1. And then the shiny, plump one, it was up to 14 right away, which I could do better than that. But 14 was pretty good. How do we know that? You just Google the chart. Oh, the chart's not on there. I don't have the chart back here. Oh, can't do that. Oh, there it is. So there's a lot of bricks charts out there, the refractometer indexes. The first time that I got the refractometer, I went to the gas station and did the gas station milk, and then I did my neighbor's milk, and then I got really excited, right? I did the fruit at the grocery store, and then I did the fruit in my garden. But you can start to get baseline numbers, right? And it's kind of cool. But that will tell us, it really does correlate to the vitality. Okay, so this last one, I think is kind of interesting just for observation. This is again from Nicole Masters for the Love of Soil. Nicole Masters is amazing, and she does a lot of holistic monitoring. But basically, this aligned with a lot that I see with the people that I work with, is that we're really looking all the time at the land, and we're really looking all the time at our bank account or the bottom line, and we forget to look at ourselves. So this is self-care, family, community, spiritual connection, happiness. We also should be tracking, because there's oftentimes a correlation with farmers about what's happening with their own personal and then what's happening with their land. So it's similar to the bullseye, in which you have that 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then you mark your number, how you are doing in those areas. You sort of get this polygon, and you can kind of see how the polygon might shift throughout the different seasons. We're still looking at animal welfare and nutrient density and all that good stuff, but we're also remembering to look at ourselves. Did that farming season make me sick? What am I going to do about that next year? How am I not going to be sick? Am I starting to get arthritis in my wrists and hands? What do I need to do? Is that going to change my enterprise? Is that going to change my bottom line? Right? So we really need to be aware of that for ourselves, so we don't wake up totally incapacitated one day or worse. Okay, so 324. Trying to decide what to do. Any questions while I'm deciding?
I'm just wondering if you have a recommendation for a mix of cover crops that would multiple species milk stage to crimp it at the right moment. And I've done some things that didn't work. And I'm curious, hearing you talk about sorghum Sudan and just like maybe tillet is a better option. So hearing that has kind of like shifted my question. Do you have any recommendations for like a mix that you would recommend?
For mechanical crimping.
Yeah.
I mean, the most universal ones are rye, oats, and millet in my world. Those are the most flexible for any season, timing, like early harvest, late harvest, miss the harvest. So those grains, I think, are the easiest ones. In particular, if you're trying to build the soil, why not use the grain because that organic matter is so high. But then the rules of 3 make me want to add in a nitrogen fixer and a pollinator or root crop to that mix. So if you have compaction, I would add in the tillage radish. If you're tilling it in, yeah, just try to do that, but don't make it like your routine practice, right? We use that as a leverage point practice to get us to a certain state, and then we should be able to just keep it on the top of the ground. But really, yeah, a lot of cool things happen with the tillage of the cover crops. Yep.
Our family has raw dairy, and you were mentioning that you could use that to inoculate soil. Is there, I mean, if it's easier, I can look it up, but you have a quick way to tell me how to do that?
Ooh, you can use a backpack sprayer or a regular sprayer. Man, how about, can you open lessons, the lessons one? What I'm really excited about is just like using all of the infrastructure for toxic agriculture for regenerative agriculture. And particularly a lot of the, let's do this. So I'll show you a couple of them, but essentially it's bulk tank or backpack sprayer are probably the easiest ways to do it. Depends about the season. So as long as it's warm enough for those microbes to stay alive, anytime within that warmth is probably ideal. And then especially like seeding or young, or if you're about to enter into like a high pest point, would be like strategic enter. And you could also look up Abe Collins. He has a few more tips on that. So this is, us using a tree planter for free from our local NRCS for asparagus roots. Okay, so I'm really into like looking at how we can use existing infrastructure, and this is a little bit different than site assessment, but your question just made me prompt it, and I can go really quickly through this. I just want to show you a couple things. The nurse crop situation is really important. So a lot of these cover crops, like just add 10% oats to anything you do, because that nurse crop really helps. I just throw in a 10% oats minimum. Every farm should have a nursery. That's what I think, because we should grow our own plants because they're really expensive. And right now, this is the worst year we've ever experienced with plant stock and germplasm. Frightening level, low level of availability. And so we need to start growing our own and sharing our own and building that wealth on farm. These are some mistakes, the most common top mistakes or tips, tricks that I see on farms. Is that people don't do wide enough alleys when they start trying to do their alley cropping. So really, like, measure your equipment plus the trailer, right? Not just the equipment. Or that turnaround factor. We see constantly fencing or trees planted without fully thinking about the turnaround situation. Diversity in the right place. I kind of mentioned this, like choose where you're going to do your diversity. Choose your top main enterprises that you're putting your money into, and then figure out how you're going to diversify the ecosystem after that. Thinking about those succession crops. So what's going to bring you money right now? What's going to bring you money in 10 years? What's going to bring you money in 20 or 30 years? Can you plant that woodlot right now that you could harvest the black walnuts in 25 years for? That's how Thousand Hills Cattle Company got started. He harvested his black walnut lot. So, just thinking about what's that succession, because the ecological succession equals your economic succession. Know your markets. Honeyberry, I love honeyberry. Honeyberry is not the best thing if you're bringing it to market, right? Because it's so fresh and sensitive. This is why we don't see a lot of like Central American crops up here, because they just don't make it, frankly. But this is the earliest pollinator. This is the earliest fruiting in my climate, and it's amazing. So can we value add it? Can we just get a closer local market? Just think about, like, this is a niche. No one else has honeyberry. It's blowing up in Canada. So we should look at it.
Is the one on the right or left?
On the right. Yep, sorry, on the right. Yeah, so know your markets. The raspberries, lots of people really get into the raspberries and they're like, what am I doing? I can't harvest all these, And so maybe it's a you pick, right? Maybe it's a one and done and you just do canned jam. So just like thinking about that really quick. Farm hack, I love farm hack. We've done a number of farm hacks. So using that old equipment, so around me, the grain bins are everywhere. I put the mulch in the grain bin, pull the grain bin down, and it mulches along my row, right? You can do this without a tractor or with a tractor. But how many different ways can we use this old equipment that's laying around? Works really nice for like the alley cropping or silvopasture systems. If you're lower scale and don't have a lot of money to invest in row mulchers, right? The old tanks. So here, we're finding old tanks that were used for poison, and we're using them now for sprays, holistic sprays, or irrigation. And particularly a lot of farmers can't afford a well right when they get new land. And so ways that we can fill up tanks, move tanks, if we're remediating someone's land with goats and sheep, we need to bring water to them. So these tanks are really valuable. Stock up on them if you have access to them. This is a blueberry mulcher. So that's a little higher end and something that you could community share potentially. Rotary rake. This is kind of cool. Like you can go down your line and the rotary rake throws the hay onto your trees. So it's just another way that we're thinking about using current equipment for perennialization of the farm. Tree transplanter, hazelnuts into rye. So just how many different ways can we use these things? Coolbot, urban farm, using a storage container, shipping container. How many different ways can we use shipping containers? This was a Coolbot one, and it's awesome. Elderberry destemmer. So elderberry, everybody loves elderberry. There's so much about elderberry, but guess what? We can't machine harvest it. So we're still in, you really need to know that. So if you get really excited about a perennial crop, make sure you know its full cycle before you get into it, and if you're going to be hand harvesting it or what you're going to do about that. And how quick do you need to get it to freeze and all of that. So the elderberry destemmer, we're starting to see the elderberry cooperative in my area. We can share these, and it's awesome. And we just put it on a trailer, and it's a whole mobile thing. So we have the destemmer, and we have a 3-sink system, and it goes straight to buckets, and then it goes to the next elderberry farm. And then bike, anything that you can do with a bike. So, whatever you can. So this just spins the honey out and gets the comb and the honey separated, and people love to do it. So if you have a honey thing on your farm, like, why not add a cycling to it? But then you can also make a smoothie, or you can do whatever. Once you have the cycle power, you can dry, you can do a lot. You can rinse your lettuce. So once you have that set up, it's great if you're smaller scale, if you have children or agritourism enterprises on your land, highly recommended. Okay, so should we go walk around a little bit? Okay, let's do it. Hopefully it hasn't got, it's supposed to be horrible weather today, and look, it's not raining too bad.